as a test, and I don't know how we'll do on the audio because I won't have anyone to check with. We're still wrestling with the headset. All right, well, that's taken care of. All right, this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. This is Just in Time Productions Facebook Live, and we are going to be talking today about the Game Mastery series, and this will be an ongoing week by week presentation. I'm going to go ahead and start at this point. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. It is very nearly noon on this fine, fun day morning. I'm a few seconds early, but that's okay because this is a chance to do system checks and things that I probably should have done earlier. Yes, my timers are all going off here at the same time. All right. So today we're going to be going over the Game Mastery 101 series and speaking in particular in terms of an overview of what is covered in this material. We are going to be, there we go. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. Welcome to Games Mastery 101. This is the inaugural episode, and we will be going over the subjects that are included in this first episode. Well, we'll be utilizing this first episode to go over the materials that are included in the Game Mastery 101 series that will soon be available through the Momentous Living Academy. What I have determined is that it is my purpose to help game masters become more effective in putting together their games events to draw more players to be included and to increase the enjoyment and intensity of the sessions to make roleplay a more appealing and more inclusive means of gameplay. We will be, I need to stop that. The topics that will be covered in the Game Mastery series will cover things in a coherent and progressive fashion, and by that I mean I intend to I'm learning a lot here about myself, even in the introspection of the first few minutes of this presentation. The series itself will be established over 7 sessions in actuality, 6 primary and a bonus session. Yes. Start. All right. In particular, the first session of the Game Mastery series will cover a glossary of terms to make it easier for us to communicate. Those of you who have been game masters for a long time will find some of this redundant, and yet some of it, I believe, will be critically important for us to be on the same page when it comes to discussing deeper issues later on. And so the functionality of it will cover such things as general terms. What by definition is a player versus a player's character? What are non-player characters, and who is the game master, and what is a game master? Is it the same as a dungeon master? Is it the same as a storyteller, and so on? We'll also include utilization of terms like what is a game session, what are considered to be in-game or out-of-game experiences, what can be included in the term min-maxing, and ultimately how to recognize and mitigate the metagaming that occasionally crops up in role-play games and is perhaps endemic of the current world culture, where everyone has access to both game master data and player data through the internet. Beyond that, we will also talk about scalar terms. We'll talk about what is meant when you say the term campaign versus what is a module, or if a game master refers to milestones, to what is he referring. The idea of in conflict versus out of conflict engagements, the value of role play versus dice-based role play. We'll go into that in particular, and also the functionality of in-character role play versus out-of-character information gathering, and also speak about how that same metagaming environment that is endemic exterior to the games has begun to creep within games, and how to maintain a balance between the two. Now, the next functionality within the glossary will be terms that will be useful for discussing system and game design, in particular how to define locations, terms, conditions, situations in a coherent and useful fashion, by determining the scale of the encounter, by determining where in the story particular events occur and what kinds of implications those occurrences might have. We'll also discuss operational terms. These would be the kind of issues that talk about how to give a description for a location, or how to describe an NPC. What kinds of compelling information can you provide to a player that make them want to engage with the environment, and how to reveal information that the players themselves gather because of character specifics or perhaps their own cleverness. Beyond that, we'll also have to deal with game-specific terms, because every game session out there has a vocabulary that is specific to it. And on a larger scale, that same kind of identifying effects can change the way players interact with the game, and indeed determine things like if there's a scoring process, if there is advancement, if there are developing wind conditions, and the like. Ultimately, beyond that, we'll also have to deal with vocabulary of logistics. How do players in a role-play game maintain character information? Do they have a character sheet? Do they have a portfolio? How do they track what goes on within a session? How do they keep those notes for later use? How do they manage the resources that those characters have in story? How do they, as players, keep track of information and details that they've picked up along the way to maintain coherency? And leading to that also is the idea that we'll have to have a way of looking at continuity and coherency and keeping the story moving from one session to the next, and to offer ways for players to take a positive advantage of these very metagame concepts we've been speaking about, to move the game forward instead of finding it as a effect or a challenge to that continuity. Next, we'll be looking at developing the framework for the fantasy adventure realm. This will include everything from developing story dynamics, such as establishing a place and time for the story to occur, and making that location, that concept, as realistic and as. Oh, by the way, Jeanette, I don't know if you can hear me. Could you please let me know if there's the ability to hear? I did notice that you joined us, and I just need to know whether or not the sound system is actually broadcasting, because I don't have a way to see that. I'm continuing to press on as if it does, so I'm hoping that it's all working properly. But in the area of developing the fantasy framework, the core purpose for this is to make sure that the players have a visual handle, a mental anchor for their development of their story within the game. And this will include things like establishing a concept of the location, a concept of the where, the when, and such like. This will also include the game's theme, the direction of the plot, what kinds of hooks the game master is developing to bring the players into that collective continuity, what kind of player options there are, what the ultimate outcome of the story should be, and ultimately how will the individual players and characters in the story recognize they've reached the concluding point. Now, this also includes developing perhaps higher thinking about such concepts as where the world came from. I mean, obviously, if we were playing a game set in modern era, we would have clearly defined concepts of cosmology. You know, where did the world come from? What god or gods influenced the creation of that world? What intelligent design influenced or perhaps created the very processes by which life exists? How does, if magic is a function of the fantasy environment, how does that magic work? What is it that allows that technology or that mystic energy to function? If there are gods, if there are intelligent design forces at work, how directly or indirectly do they interact with the participants? How directly do the players engage or interact with the deities that are, and do the gods themselves actually meddle in the affairs of mortal beings, and how does that interaction occur? Beyond that, we also have to look at the individual biospheres, food chains, and pecking orders within the game's environment. If we are looking at certain, say, iconic creatures, how do they anchor to the story? What kinds of details hold them in that place, and what influences are they under? Do they have specific motivations that are other than, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Are they looking for more than just food to eat and abilities to procreate and such like? What kind of potential outcomes from the interaction with these creatures might occur? At what point, at what level do the player characters become either food or enemies within these kinds of biometrics? And what kind of unintended consequences might result from the players being involved with the story itself, and how those creatures interrelate with the larger story arc that you have in mind. We also have to therefore look at, when you speak about story arcs and things like that, we have to look at the very concepts of story structure. How does what components make up a good story? What components differentiate one story type from another? I mean, when we look at literature and other forms of the entertainment format, there are a variety of these story structures. How do we, as game masters, bring that story to life, and how do we, what kinds of variables do we include? Are we going to draw the players through the story in a linear fashion, predominantly guiding their course, or are we opening up a virtual playroom, a sandbox, if you will, for the players to drive the direction of the tale? Alternatively, I have developed something I call bubble tech, which is a way for the game master to segment his creative story into some chunks and separate pieces that the players can interact with, either at their leisure or as the game master sees fit, to make sure that they stay engaged. Beyond the basic story, of course, you have various functions and terms that are, well, in the television or the motion picture realm, there are things called tropes, which are individual story pieces that are identifiable and that we sort of have become trained to interact with. So how many and which of these tropes and techniques are your players going to run into? What kind of trends do you see developing in their play style? Are they more prone to interact by communication, or are they going to be adversarial in their approach? We also have to look at the individual players' purposes and what they are wanting out of the game, and how that can be used to progress the plot and move the story forward. We want to develop the skills to listen for linking mechanisms where we can bring the players into the story and offer them opportunities to become a part of the overall story itself. Ultimately, we want to find ways to use humor, perhaps momentary shocks of horror or drama, and ultimately feed off of the players' either aggressive or hesitative actions in response to those, to push our story towards our intended conclusion, and ultimately to know when to move the milestones. Ultimately, the players will focus and change their direction for us, and we have to learn how to jump when they shift and adapt the story to meet their desires and their demands, as well as to take advantage of their individual proclivities to make our story something that's even more compelling. Ultimately, we want to develop something I call the secret sauces. These are different ways of us to control the game's environment. And in this second section called Developing a Framework, which we've been talking about, we want to look at ways to use those functionalities. We want to learn how to listen to the interaction between players and then riff off of where they're going with their individual character development. We want to find places and opportunities for them to reach minor successes and feel that they're achieving their accomplished goals. Within these different secret sauces, of course, we have things like creative interpretation, wherein we give them a description and then they either mishear it or misapply it, and then we create memorable moments in story by fomenting and promoting those very creative interpretations, those very adaptations of where we were going to make the story more effective. We also want to use the rising and falling action of a story to take advantage of the player's development, to give them the mechanisms that they need to advance where their individual characters are wanting to go in line with what we're trying to accomplish. Of course, this means ultimately we need to be able to build a perfect beast. We need to be able to create villains and nemesis as foils for our players. If we do this in a constructive way, we actually give them insight into where our heads are, and at the same time show that we've listened to and adapted to what they were submitting into this situation. And ultimately, we want to use these villains to apply appropriate and proportionate pressure to the plot to progress it towards the goals that we have set forth for it. Now, in addition to this, we have to find ways to increase the believability, the internalization, if you will, of the game session for our players. And this will include things like building a basic map that they can visualize, whether it be a tangible locational map or if it's a mind's eye theater understanding of where relativistically locations are compared to one another. Ultimately, the purpose for this is to bring the world to life so that the players no longer see their characters as a piece of paper they hold in their hand and a tiny token, if you will, in the larger scale of the game, but instead see themselves as the change agents and moving forces within a game's environment. This means that we can take the things that they say within story and make those perhaps offhand messages meaningful and reacting to the externalized fears and issues that they may have brought up. This also means that we need to be creatively derivative and inspirationally able to infer their direction as we go along. Now, this also leads, therefore, to ultimately one of the most powerful tools in roleplay, which is the power of prophecy. And by this, I refer to situations and conditions that the players are placed into wherein their actions can be predicted, and you can cause them to be spun in directions as you intend, which, of course, quite often can mystify and surprise the players. So in this, concluding this final portion of the second section, we'll be looking at developing the ability to create expectation with intent. In other words, we will, through developing this framework, not only know where the story is going, but how it will progress, and thereby be able to maintain the much desired mastery of the game. Now, ultimately, the third section that we'll be moving into is how to breathe life into your game. The biggest challenge, perhaps, to making a role-play game an enjoyable experience is for the players to feel and experience as part of the world themselves. This means the development of an understanding of the world, a idea of the very scale of things. If I move a barrel, is it meaningless, or perhaps did I assist somebody in a job, or did I make their work more difficult? Did I impact anything with my actions? And the more personally we develop the story, the more directly we involve it, the greater the global impact can be, because the players then see themselves as the very agency by which the story is moved. This also means we can develop this process through both physical, tangible items such as tabletop miniatures and effective terrain, or utilizing these miniatures or these markers as icons for the individuals, or even as unit markers on a larger scale. Ultimately, these all will tie into the basis of roleplay, which is the mind's eye theater, but it has to give the player a way to push off, if you will, against the environment, to see themselves as part of this growing world and to understand their place in it. Now, this does mean you also have to recognize that there is a considerable danger of breaking the suspension of disbelief that players take on if we're not cautious of our own vagaries in our communication. For example, if we are unintentionally vague and we say, oh, the building is over there, but we don't give a frame of reference of what that is, it makes it difficult for them to comprehend hiding behind the building, because there's no reference point by which you are in front of or behind something that's over there. Furthermore, we have to be careful to creatively use intentional omissions. In other words, if we want them to look inside of the box, we want to make sure we don't make the box sound insignificant. So we definitely have to, for example, describe the box in a way that omits a piece of information that will beg the question, what's in that box? What's that box for, or whatever. We also have to take into account information on the way we interact with our players. We have to realize that they have themselves brought a certain bias to the way they play, and we have to kind of delve into understanding how that works so that we can play to and with their particularities. For example, the world today has a general acceptance of things like cheat codes for video games or shortcuts for operations of different kinds of software and such. So we have to make sure that when we are playing with a group of players that they hold a commonality, and in order for us to make the game more real to them, we have to dissemble, if you will, from their normal life and give them reasons for the mythological, the created world that we're putting together to be appealing enough to draw them into it, and to move them away from perhaps perceptions that the world has offered that are counter-effective in the role-play environment. So, for example, we may need to be very clear with the players about the purpose of role-play. We may have to explain that there is no winner, there's no loser, there's no advantage to be gained by gathering information from external sources, for example, and realize that the very existence of cell phones and smartphones that can gather information is itself a danger that we have to be careful of, and perhaps win over the hearts and minds of our players away from the technology. Next, we also have to talk about the fun aspects of role play. We want to talk about the playfulness and internal competitiveness. We want to talk about the comedy versus coherency. We don't want the story to be derailed or short-circuited because players became too involved with inadvertent puns, or perhaps intentionally manipulating other players to disrupt the story. Ultimately, we have to let the players know when to quit with the comedy and with the divergence, and get back to the storyline. And in this section on breathing life into the game, I go into ways you as a game master can definitely bring that kind of life to your game and move players away from the metagame environment. Now, this also means that in this section, we also have to learn how to be really good listeners. And so I have one part of the course is a series on the arts and sciences of listening, how to not only know when to listen to what your players have to say, but what in particular to listen for, and to learn that sometimes they say things that aren't accurate simply because they need a response. And so we have to learn to teach the players to convey their desires verbally so that we can respond to them, and to develop perhaps nuanced ways of intentionally eavesdropping on player-to-player conversations so that we can listen to what they're wanting, not necessarily what they're saying, and ultimately how we can listen to our heart as well as their desires to keep the story moving the direction that needs to go to achieve the, if you will, the end game. Ultimately, this leads in the last section of the Breathing Life section into learning to master manipulation. And by this, I don't mean inordinate over control of the environment, but instead finding ways for the story to drive itself, to learn to avoid the nose ring of the linear railroad, and how to get players to want to tell the story that you have in mind, to tell your story, while also building and developing their own story, and creating this entire process as a coalition of minds, recognizing the intentional consequences that can occur, and ultimately achieving a level of sublime nature where what the players want to do is exactly what you wanted them to do. And I can tell you that from a game master standpoint, there's nothing like that moment when the players do exactly what you needed them to do in order to achieve the goals you had for them. Now we're about halfway through the list here. I'm going to be going into the second half and talking about the different characteristics, but I wanted to thank you for your participation to this point, and to remind you that this is Jonathan Alban, the Game Market Guru, and we are speaking about the Games Mastery series, soon to be released in the Momentous Living Academy. So now moving on to the second half, we're going to be looking at things like defining the master's touch. Now, when a person takes on the role of being a games master, the obvious routine development of the monsters the players have to fight and the treasures they might gather by succeeding, these are all mundane and routine things that arguably most video games get a pretty good handle on. But when I speak of defining the master's touch, we have to learn to make the story compelling and creative in such a fashion that we can drive the tempo and drive the timing so that the players can feel exactly the emotions, the uncomfort or discomfort that we intend for them to feel at certain sessions. And to develop these skills, we have to look at a bunch of things. Well, first of all, we have to talk about pacing and tempo. How do you keep the story moving forward? How do you engage the players in a way that gets them to recognize the direction and the speed at which they need to move? This also means that we need to look at our players in terms of story drivers and speed bumps, recognizing that there are roles within a player group that have to be developed, and whether you do it intentionally and externally or the players do it on their own, being able to reconcile the difference in the various players' play styles will go a long distance to choreographing the players' strengths into the roles they should be involved with. Another piece of this puzzle is learning to demystify player conflict. For decades, when I was first starting, it was tough to get past player versus player conflict because personality gets involved. A lot of what we now recognize as metagame or external influences shift and adjust the way players interact, and being able to utilize the metagame environment to be able to step away from the table, so to speak, and say, hey, Bob, I know you've got a problem with Charlie because he used to see your girlfriend or something like that. We have to be able to bring those metagame environments into alignment with where we're going in order to encourage player development and to link the players into a progression of their character over time that is both satisfactory to them from a scoring standpoint. They feel like they've accomplished much, but more importantly, we're lining them up to be able to face the enemies and the problems that we plan for them in front of us. Of course, this means that we have to look at each player as somewhat of a starstruck special snowflake. We have to recognize that everyone at some point has some level of stage fright, and perhaps before they got involved with role play, they've already accomplished that, but they may not have. Perhaps they're stuck in a place where even taking on a role in a role play game is intimidating, and so we want to help them overcome these difficulties. We want to encourage individual player thought so that they don't simply sit on the sidelines and wait for others to engage, but rather start to see themselves as the problem solvers. This means we also have to retrain some of them because of the way our world works to think again in terms of a turn-based methodology, to recognize that you can't always be the center of attention at all times, particularly if you're in an environment where there are 4 or 5 or 6 other starstruck special snowflakes there too as well. Ultimately, we have to take away their tantrums, figure out what their triggers are, and create opportunities for them to excel as a player and to grow together to see the direction that they could go into. Of course, this means that we as game masters have to develop the means to adjust the focus and to shift and misdirect the players as necessary so that the story will be the ultimate objective and not necessarily just the character development. This means that we have to learn how to be ambiguous and precise selectively, developing ways to impact players' faulty memories of situations and thereby feed into them the information we need so that the times between the game sessions, the rest of the story can sink in and they can realize what we were guiding them towards, the implications we were focusing them on. Next, we need to look at a section that I call directing from behind the screen. This is the skill base that the game master himself has to develop in order to take on all the various roles that a game master has to be. In other words, to look at the standpoint of a director, what makes a story compelling, what pieces will draw the players to become involved, how we also have to consider how realistic the session is and look at it from the standpoint of how do we develop in the minds of the players a form of cinematics where they're seeing the action and they're experiencing it viscerally and not just vicariously. We need to understand how the player dynamics work so that we can leverage one player against the others. We need to be able to build a story legacy where players recognize each other's value to the story and therefore they eagerly await the other player's involvement, which of course leads to a discussion I cleverly call the whithertos and why-fors of kibitzing during a game. How do you get the players to talk out of character about things in character that you need them to remember? Ultimately, this leads to story building from the inside out. How do you get the players inside of your tale to want to drive the story forward? And ultimately, this leads to an effective use of the you see to me's. And I'll explain what those are in detail during one of the sessions as well. This, of course, leads then to how does a game master develop these skills. And so I have an entire section called resource mining and refinement, where game masters can learn how to utilize external story mechanisms that they can draw into their own story, tools that they can use to create a compelling timeline and to begin to see the story itself as a character in its own development, so that the game master no longer sees himself as an external judge of the story, but instead as an active member propelling the advancement of the story every bit as much as the characters are trying to propel their own advancement. This means that we have to develop particular in-game vocabulary and dialects so that people will know how the story is progressing and will perhaps be misdirected away from the sources from which the information comes. Ultimately, we have to be able to put it all out on the table. We want the players to see us as transparent, even as we manipulate behind the scenes the direction, because then we can develop and comprehend truly what your story is about and bring that story to the table. Now, as a bonus section, now what we've talked about so far are the subjects of the class itself. Ultimately, I did add a bonus section, which I laughingly call How to Avoid a Total Party Kill. And these are tips and techniques that I recommend for game masters to employ that will guarantee that the player characters will be able to reach the objectives that you intend. Instead of building an airtight villain plot line that they arguably might overlook or fail to accomplish, this PK avoidance section actually talks about how to set up your villains with fallibilities, foibles, and fates that will allow your players to ultimately succeed in the long term, even as they face these challenges session over session. Well, I'm dropping through this information a little bit faster than I intended, but we are 40 minutes into the show. And with my low turnout for this episode, I'm going to go ahead and close at this time. And we'll be re-editing this for YouTube use a little bit later, and including more visuals and things like that. I want to thank you for your attendance. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, and this has been Games Mastery 101 through Just in Times Productions Facebook Live. Thank you very much.